The night Robert Kendrick rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, the wind had teeth, and the woman standing outside the Silver Spur Saloon was bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow and shaking so hard her teeth rattled like loose spurs on a wooden floor. He had planned to ride straight through. He always planned to ride straight through. Robert pulled back on the reins of his roan mare, a steady animal he called Copper, and squinted through the darkness at the figure pressed against the rough clapboard wall of the saloon. She was not dressed for the cold. She wore a plain cotton dress, dark blue or maybe gray. It was hard to tell in the lamplight spilling beneath the saloon doors, and her arms were wrapped around herself as though she were trying to hold her own body together. A carpetbag sat at her feet, worn at the corners, one clasp broken. Her hair had come loose from its pins, dark brown waves falling past her shoulders in the wind. She did not look like a woman who belonged outside a saloon at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night in October. She looked like a woman who had nowhere else to stand. Robert dismounted slowly, looping Copper's reins around the hitching post. He pulled off his canvas duster, the heavy brown coat that had kept him warm across 3 states and 2 brutal winters on the cattle trail, and he walked toward her with it already open in his hands. She heard his boots on the boardwalk and her head snapped up. Her eyes were dark in the lamplight, and there was fear in them, quick and animal, the kind of fear a person learns from experience. "Easy," he said, and he kept his voice low and level the way he would with a spooked horse. "I am not going to hurt you. You are shaking half to death and you have a cut on your head. Take the coat." She stared at him. Her jaw was set in a hard line and he could see she was deciding something fast, calculating the risk of him against the certainty of the cold. "I do not need charity," she said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. "It is not charity," he said. "It is just a coat. You can give it back when you are warm." A long moment passed. The wind pushed down the empty main street of Caldwell, rattling the sign above the general store, picking up a handful of dust and throwing it at nothing in particular. From inside the saloon came the hollow knock of a piano playing something almost like a waltz. She took the coat. She pulled it around her shoulders and it fell nearly to her knees on account of how tall he was, and she looked at him over the collar with those dark eyes and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way a door opens a crack when someone knocks gently enough. "Ruth Finley," she said. "Robert Kendrick," he said and tipped his hat. He looked at the cut above her eyebrow. It had stopped bleeding, but it was angry-looking, crusted at the edges. "You want to tell me how that happened?" "No," she said simply. "All right," he said. He was not a man who pushed. He had learned early that pushing people only made them close down tighter. "Is there somewhere you are supposed to be tonight, Miss Finley?" She looked down at the carpetbag at her feet. "I was supposed to be inside that saloon waiting for a man named Harlan Pruitt, who was supposed to arrive on the 6 o'clock coach from Wichita. The coach came. Harlan Pruitt was not on it." She paused. "I came west on the understanding that I would be marrying him. He placed an advertisement in the Wichita Beacon, and I answered it and we exchanged 4 letters and I sold everything I owned in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to come here." Robert was quiet for a moment. He looked at the carpetbag, at her dress, at the cut above her eye. "Who hit you?" She was quiet too. Then she said, "The saloon keeper told me I could not stay inside without purchasing a drink, and when I explained my situation to a man at the bar, he took offense at being interrupted and struck me. The saloon keeper put me out rather than the man who struck me." Robert felt something tighten in his chest, slow and steady, the way a rope tightens when weight is added to it. Was the saloon keeper a heavy-set man with a gray beard? Yes. That would be Earl Totham. He looked at the saloon doors and then looked back at her. "He is not known for his decency." "I have gathered that," she said. "Is there a boarding house in this town?" "Mrs. Clara Briggs runs one on the north end of Elm Street. But I have $11.30 to my name, and I do not know what she charges, and I do not know this town, and I cannot pretend I am not frightened." She said it all in a rush, without self-pity, just facts laid out plainly, and she lifted her chin when she finished as though daring him to feel sorry for her. He did feel sorry for her, but he also felt something else, something he could not name cleanly yet, something that had to do with the way she said frightened without looking away from him. "Mrs. Briggs charges $2 a week," he said. "She is a fair woman. She will treat you right." He reached into his shirt pocket and drew out a folded bill. He held it out to her. "Consider this a loan. I will write my name and where I am headed on a paper, and you can find me and pay it back when you have settled." She looked at the bill. She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because I had a mother and 2 sisters and I would want someone to do the same for them." She did not take the money right away. He kept his hand out, patient and steady. Finally she took it, and when her fingers brushed his palm they were ice cold even through the coat. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "I am working for the Rocking H outfit, driving cattle south to the Indian Territory line and then back up through to a buyer in Abilene," he said. "But I stop through Caldwell regular enough. I am due back through in about 3 weeks." She folded the bill and tucked it somewhere inside the coat, and she looked at him steadily. "I will pay you back, Mr. Kendrick. You have my word." "I believe you," he said, and he did. He walked her to the boarding house himself, carrying her carpet bag despite her protest, because the main street of Caldwell at night was not a safe place for a woman alone, and she was in no condition to argue effectively. "Mrs. Clara Briggs answered the door in her nightcap and robe, took one look at Ruth and then one look at Robert, and seemed to understand the entire situation in about 3 seconds, because she was the kind of woman who had seen everything twice. "Come in, dear," Mrs. Briggs said to Ruth, and opened the door wider. Robert set the carpetbag down in the hallway. He turned to Ruth, and she was looking at him with the coat still around her shoulders and her hair still wild from the wind, and the lamp from inside the boarding house throwing warm light across one side of her face. 3 weeks, he said, and touched the brim of his hat. 3 weeks, she said quietly. He walked back to Copper, mounted up, and rode to the livery on the south end of town to settle the horse for the night. He lay on a cot in a back room that Hector Diaz, the livery keeper, rented out for $10 a night, and he stared at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about dark eyes and a set jaw and a voice steadier than hands that were shaking. He did not sleep well. He rose before dawn, saddled Copper, and rode south toward the Indian Territory line with the rest of the Rocking H crew, 6 men including Foreman Ben Lassiter, a broad-shouldered Oklahoma man with a red mustache and a habit of whistling hymns while he worked. The cattle drive took him through 2 weeks of hard riding, cold nights, river crossings, and a stretch of rain so relentless that the ground turned to soup, and the cattle bellowed their displeasure in low, mournful voices. Robert worked and did not think about Ruth Finley, or rather he thought about her and told himself he was not thinking about her, which amounted to the same thing. Ben Lassiter noticed. Ben Lassiter always noticed things. They were camped on the 3rd night south of the Cimarron, the cattle settled and the fire burning low, when Ben looked at Robert across the flames and said, "You've been somewhere else in your head since Caldwell. Want to tell me what happened there?" "Nothing happened," Robert said. Ben Lassiter made a sound that communicated clearly his opinion of that answer without committing it to actual words. "There was a woman," Robert said, looking at the fire. "A woman in a bad situation. I helped her out some and left her with Mrs. Briggs." "What kind of woman?" "The kind who takes a coat in a windstorm and says she does not need charity in the same breath," Robert said. Ben was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a good kind of woman." "I know it," Robert said, and poked at the fire with a stick, and neither of them said anything else about it. The drive finished without major incident. The buyer in Abilene was a man named Clarence Whitfield, who inspected every animal with the suspicious thoroughness of someone who had been cheated before, counted out the money twice, and shook hands like he was trying to reassess the bones in your fingers. Ben Lassiter collected the pay, settled with the hands, and told them they were free until the spring gather. Robert rode back toward Caldwell with money in his pocket, and something sharp and anticipatory sitting in his chest that he refused to call hope. He arrived back in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon, 22 days after he had left. The town was busy with the afternoon commerce of a cattle trail supply point. Wagons in the street, horses at the rails, the general store active, a group of cowboys from some other outfit taking up the boardwalk in front of the Silver Spur. Robert rode past the saloon and did not look at it, and told himself he would stable Copper first and then find a meal, and then, incidentally, if it happened to come up, he might stop by Mrs. Briggs's boarding house to collect the coat he had left behind. He was lying to himself and he knew it, but it was a comfortable lie and he let it stand. He stabled Copper at Diaz's livery, and Hector Diaz, a compact man of about 50 with quick dark eyes and a directness Robert had always liked, looked up from the hoof he was inspecting and said, "Welcome back, Kendrick. The Finley woman at Briggs's has been asking after you." Robert stopped in the middle of hanging his saddle. "She has. Twice," Hector said. "Once about 10 days ago and again last Friday." Robert told himself this did not mean anything and finished hanging his saddle with what he hoped was a normal amount of care. He washed his face and hands at the pump behind the livery, put on the clean shirt he kept rolled in his saddlebag, and walked north on Elm Street with his hat in his hand and his hair still damp. Mrs. Briggs's boarding house was a 2-story frame building painted white, with a porch that ran the full width of the front and a clematis vine that had given up its last flowers for the season. Mrs. Briggs herself was on the porch with a basket of mending, and she looked up when Robert came through the gate and smiled with the particular smile of a woman who has been expecting something to happen and is pleased to be proven right. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, "Ruth is in the kitchen garden out back. She has been doing some work for me in exchange for her room." Robert went around the side of the house. The kitchen garden was a tidy rectangle between the house and a small outbuilding, the last of the autumn vegetables still clinging on in their rows. Ruth Finley was crouched at the far end of it, pulling carrots from the earth with an efficient, focused energy that reminded him of the way she had stood outside the saloon, not defeated, just working with what she had. She heard his boots on the path and looked up, and the expression that moved across her face before she controlled it was the most straightforward thing he had seen in a long time. It was relief and pleasure and something she was trying very hard not to show, and it lasted about 2 seconds before she put a careful, composed look in its place and stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. "You are back," she said. "I said 3 weeks," he said. "You said about 3 weeks. It has been 22 days, he almost smiled. "I see you have been counting." A faint color came up in her cheeks and she looked at the carrots in her hand rather than at him. "I wanted to repay my debt." "I have your money. And your coat." She did not look embarrassed exactly, but something in her voice was careful in a way that told him the admission cost her something. "The coat can wait," he said. "How are you? Is that cut healed?" She touched her eyebrow unconsciously. There was a small scar there now, pale pink, mostly faded. "Yes, Mrs. Briggs cleaned it up properly. I am well." A pause. "I have a situation I am managing." "What kind of situation?" She set the carrots down in the basket at her feet and looked at him directly. "I have had no word from Harlan Prout. I went to the sheriff's office and asked them to make inquiries, and was told that Harlan Prout does not appear to exist, or if he does, the address he gave me in Wichita belongs to a building that is a tobacco shop and not a home." She said this evenly, but he could see the effort in her jaw. "I was deceived. I do not know for what purpose, perhaps just by a coward who wanted the sport of it, or perhaps something worse. But I am here with no connection to anyone and no means to return to Pennsylvania, and I have been thinking seriously about what to do." "What have you decided?" Robert asked. "I am a school teacher," she said. "I taught in Harrisburg for 3 years. I spoke with the minister at the Methodist church here, a Reverend Aldous Cleary, and he told me there is a need for a school teacher in Caldwell. The current arrangement is inadequate. Children taught by a farmer named Watkins who means well but cannot spell consistently." There is a small school building on 2nd Street. Reverend Cleary is going to put it to the town council. She lifted her chin. I am going to stay. I am going to make something real here. Robert looked at her standing in the kitchen garden in the October light, dirt on her hands, carrots in her basket, talking about spelling and town councils with the absolute conviction of someone who had decided the ground under her feet was real whether anyone else believed it or not. I think you will, he said, and he meant it completely. They stood in the garden for a moment, and the wind moved through the remaining corn stalks at the edge of the property with a dry, papery sound, and somewhere up the street a dog was barking at something. Would you have supper with me tonight, Miss Finley? He asked. There is a decent eating house 2 streets over. Mrs. Prentice runs it. The pie is exceptional. She looked at him as though weighing something. You should know, Mr. Kendrick, that I do not have romantic intentions toward cowboys. I came out west to marry, yes, but I came to build a life, and a man who is always moving does not build a life in one place. He appreciated the honesty. He had thought the same thing himself many times. I understand that, he said, but I am not asking you to anything except to have supper and eat pie. The rest we can figure out in whatever order it comes. After a moment she said, All right, supper. Mrs. Prentice's eating house was a long room with oil lamps on every table and a smell of wood smoke and roasting meat that was, in Robert's experience, the finest smell known to the civilized world after a month on the trail. Mrs. Prentice herself was a stout, cheerful woman of about 60 who knew everyone's business and made no secret of it, and she put Robert and Ruth at a corner table and brought coffee without being asked. They talked for 2 hours. Robert had not talked to anyone like that in years, not since his mother died when he was 20, and his sisters had both married and moved to Missouri, and he had spent the intervening 7 years working cattle through Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, without much call for real conversation. Ruth asked questions and listened to the answers, actually listened, which was rarer than people thought, and she had opinions about everything and stated them plainly and was not at all apologetic about having them. She was from Philadelphia, originally. Her father had been a school teacher, and her mother had kept a boarding house not unlike Mrs. Briggs's, and Ruth had grown up with 1 foot in a classroom, and 1 foot in the steady, practical business of keeping a house running and strangers fed and comfortable. She had come to Harrisburg for a teaching position and had stayed 3 years and had been happy enough there, but she had wanted more, she said, with a gesture that was not dramatic but simply honest, more room, more sky, more of whatever it was she could not quite name that had made her scan the pages of the Wichita Beacon and see the advertisement and think, yes, this. Even though the advertisement was a lie, Robert said. Even though, she said. The reason I responded to it was real. The man was not, but the wanting was. She looked at him across the lamp. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. I think it does. He told her about himself in return, which he was not accustomed to doing. He was 28 years old from a small farm in central Kansas near a town called Medicine Lodge. His father had died when he was 16, and he had worked the farm for 2 years trying to make it go, and then realized it was not going to go no matter what he did, because the soil was bad and the water was unreliable, and his father had known it too and simply refused to admit it. He had sold what he could, given his sisters their share, and gone to work with a cattle outfit and found that he was good at it. He could read weather, read cattle, read terrain. He could work from before dawn until after dark without it breaking him. He was patient with animals and men alike, and patient people were valuable on the cattle trail. But you are tired of it, Ruth said, watching him. He was quiet a moment. What makes you say that? Because when you talk about the farm you look like a man looking at something he lost, she said. And when you talk about the cattle trail you look like a man who is trying to convince himself of something. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. My father's farm did not work because it was in the wrong place, he said slowly. There is land in the Cherokee Strip worth farming, good soil, reliable water. I have ridden through it enough times to know the land. The government is talking about opening it up proper in the coming years. There are homestead claims being filed all along the Kansas Indian Territory border already. And that is what you want, she said. That is what I have been thinking about for about 4 years, he said. I have money saved, not enough yet, close, she nodded. She did not say anything else about it, but she looked at him with that look that meant she was filing something away, and he had the strange sensation of being understood by someone he had known for less than a month, which was both comfortable and unsettling in equal measure. When they left Mrs. Prentice's, the night was clear and cold, a hard frost coming on, and he walked her back to Mrs. Briggs's and stood at the gate and looked at her in the moonlight and thought about things he did not say. "Thank you for supper," she said. "Thank you for the company," he said. "Are you leaving again soon?" she asked, and the question was measured and careful. "No," he said, "not right away. I have winter ahead and no drive until spring. I will be around Caldwell for a while," she nodded, and there was something that might have been relief in the line of her shoulders. "Good night, Mr. Kendrick. Good night, Miss Finley." He walked back toward the livery with his hands in his pockets and the cold air sharp in his lungs and something warm and almost uncomfortable spreading through his chest, something he thought he had better be careful with and knew already he was not going to be careful with at all. The winter came to Caldwell in earnest by November and settled in like a difficult house guest who had no intention of leaving. The town contracted against the cold, the cattle trade slowing as the season turned, the population thinning as trail crews dispersed to whatever warmer places they thought of as home. Robert stayed. He picked up work where he could, helping Hector Diaz at the livery, doing some repair work for the hardware merchant, cutting wood for Mrs. Briggs at a rate that had as much to do with having a reason to be near the boarding house as with any real economic necessity. Ruth Finley got her teaching position. The town council of Caldwell met in the first week of November and voted 5-1 to hire her at a salary of $32 a month, which was not generous but was something. And she moved from the boarding house to a small 2-room house on 2nd Street that the town provided along with the position. It was a plain, drafty little house with a Franklin stove and windows that rattled in the wind, and she made it hers within a week. Hanging curtains she sewed herself and putting a braided rug on the floor, and arranging her small collection of books on a shelf, she built from planks she bought at the lumber yard, and asked Robert to help her cut to size. He helped her cut the planks on a cold Saturday morning in November, the two of them in the small yard behind the school building with a saw, their breath making clouds in the air, and she held the boards steady while he cut them and handed things back and forth with the comfortable efficiency of people who had figured out how to work together. Afterward she made coffee on the Franklin stove, and they sat at the small table and drank it, and the warmth and the smell of coffee and sawdust, and the particular quality of the light through those rattling windows, made something in Robert's chest feel like home, which was a word he had not thought about with any real feeling since he was 16 years old. He came by the school most afternoons when she was finishing her day. He would wait on the bench outside while she saw the last of the children off, and then they would walk together, down to the general store if she needed anything, or along the edge of town where the prairie began, and the grass bent in long silver waves in the wind, and the sky went on and on in the particular vast way of Kansas sky that some people found oppressive and some people found beautiful. Ruth found it beautiful. She stood at the edge of town on those late November afternoons with the cold wind in her hair, and looked at the horizon with an expression that was so genuinely happy it made Robert's chest ache in a good way. "I never saw so much sky in Pennsylvania," she said one afternoon. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Some people find it lonely." "No," she said. "I find it honest." She looked at him. "In Philadelphia everything is vertical, buildings and people and noise, everything is right up close to you. Out here the sky just tells you where you are. I like knowing where I am." He thought about that for a long time afterward. By December they were spending evenings together as a matter of course, not by any formal arrangement, but because it had simply become what happened after supper. He would come by her house, and she would have a lamp on and books open on the table, and she would make tea on the Franklin stove, and they would sit and talk or read, or sometimes she would read aloud from whatever book she was working through, and he would listen and add to the fire when it needed it and feel something he was not yet sure he deserved. He thought about the coat often, the way she had taken it, the way she had said she did not need charity and taken it anyway, because she was cold, and a sensible woman accepts warmth when it is offered regardless of pride, and that combination of pride and pragmatism seemed to him the most honest thing he had ever seen. He gave her the coat back in early December formally, holding it out the way he had that first night. "I was supposed to give this back when I was warm," she said, looking at it. "You do not have to give it back," he said. "I am giving it to you, keep it." She took it the same way she had the first time, that same calculating pause and then a quick, decisive acceptance, and she wore it to church on Sunday and the following Sunday after that, and something about seeing her in it gave him a feeling he eventually identified as the word his. He knew it was too soon for that. He knew enough about himself to know he was half in love with her already, and had been since that first night in the lamplight, which was foolish and probably inevitable, and he had made his peace with both of those things. What he had not made his peace with was telling her, because telling her meant opening something up that could close badly, and Ruth Finley had already been handed enough bad closes by life. Christmas came to Caldwell cold and clear. The Methodist Church had a service on Christmas Eve that half the town attended, the pews crowded, and the windows steamed over from body heat, and the choir singing carols with varying degrees of accuracy but consistent enthusiasm. Ruth sat beside him in the fourth pew and sang the carols in a clear, unself-conscious soprano, and he held the hymnal open for both of them, and she glanced at him once during, "O come all ye faithful," and when their eyes met, she quickly looked back at the page but did not stop smiling. After the service, they walked home through the snow. It was a dry, quiet snow, the kind that fell straight down with no wind to interfere, and the street lamps threw gold circles on the white ground, and everything was very still and clean. At the door of her house she turned to him and said, "Merry Christmas, Robert." She had not called him by his first name before. "Merry Christmas, Ruth," he said. She was looking at him with something in her face that was not the careful, measured look she usually wore, something less guarded and more open, and he could feel the distance between them and thought about closing it, and then thought about all the reasons not to. "Good night," he said. She studied him for a moment. "Good night," she said, and something in her voice suggested she had also been thinking about closing the distance and had arrived at the same cautious conclusion. He walked home through the snow and told himself to be patient. In January, patience got tested. A man named Gerald Hargrove arrived in Caldwell on the stage from Wichita, a lawyer and land agent from the eastern side of Kansas, who had business with several of the larger property holders in town. He was a well-dressed man of about 35, with a pocket watch and a careful haircut, and the polished manners of someone who had never spent a night in a bedroll. He rented a room at the hotel and set up a temporary office, and within a week had made it his business to introduce himself to every person of note in Caldwell. He introduced himself to Ruth Finley at a church social in the second week of January, and Robert watched him do it with the particular attention of a man who is pretending not to watch. Hargrove was charming. He was polished and educated and made the right kind of conversation, asked about her teaching, and listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, and brought her a second cup of tea before she had thought to ask for one. He laughed at the right moments and held doors open, and had the kind of easy social fluency that Robert, who was more comfortable with cattle than parlors, had never quite acquired. Robert stood with Ben Lassiter, who had come through town on his way back from Wichita, and held his own cup of tea and watched Hargrove make Ruth laugh at something, a real laugh, bright and quick. "Is that man talking to your woman?" Ben said. "She is not my woman," Robert said. "Does she know that?" Ben said. Robert set down his cup. He did not go over. He was not a man who made territorial claims on people who had not asked him to, and Ruth Finley had the full right to talk to whoever she pleased. But he left the social earlier than he might have, and walked home in the January cold with his hands deep in his pockets and something sour sitting at the back of his throat. The following afternoon he came by the school at his usual time, and she was already outside, and she fell into step beside him with a brisk, purposeful energy that meant she had something on her mind. "Gerald Hargrove called on me this morning," she said. "At the school," Robert said. "Yes. He brought flowers, in January." She said this with a faint wryness that made him want to smile despite himself. "He asked if he might escort me to the winter social at the church hall on Friday." "What did you say?" Robert asked and kept his voice easy. "I said I would think about it," she said. She looked at him sideways. "He is a pleasant man." "He seems to be," Robert said. "He is settled. He has a practice in Wichita and property and prospects." A pause. "He is the sort of man I came west to marry, that kind of stability." Robert was quiet for a moment. They were walking at the edge of town, the prairie flat and gray in the January light, the grass pressed flat under a thin crust of snow. "Is that what you want?" he said. "Stability in that form, a man with a pocket watch and a parlor in Wichita." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they faced each other in the cold, and her cheeks were pink from the wind and her eyes were direct and a little challenging. "What form would you suggest?" she said. And there it was. Right there in the January light with the prairie behind her and the cold air between them. She had cut straight to it the way she always did, and he had no excuse left to be careful. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "and I am not going to dress it up because I do not know how to dress things up and you would see through it anyway." He pulled off his hat and held it. "I have been in love with you since the night I put that coat on your shoulders. I know that is a ridiculous thing to say about a woman I have known 4 months. I know I am a cowhand who works other men's cattle and owns nothing but a horse and a bedroll and some money in a bank in Abilene. I know Gerald Hargrove has better prospects on paper. I am not asking you to choose me over a sensible life. I am just telling you the truth because you deserve the truth, and because I cannot stand here and watch you weigh a man like Hargrove, without you knowing that I would do absolutely anything that needs doing to build a life worth living. And that I have been thinking about a piece of land in the Cherokee Strip for 4 years, and I have almost enough money to file a claim, and I intend to do it in the spring, and that I have not told anyone else that because until now it has only been about me, and it occurs to me that I do not want it to be only about me anymore." He stopped talking. He was aware that he had said considerably more than he had planned to say, and that the cold wind was blowing and she was looking at him with an expression he could not read, which was unusual because he could generally read her. She was quiet for a long time, not an uncomfortable quiet, just the quiet of someone thinking seriously and with full attention. "You are in love with me," she said, as though confirming a fact. "Yes," he said. "Since the night you gave me your coat." "Yes." "That was 4 months ago. You did not say anything." "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because you had just had a bad experience of a man making promises that turned out to be lies, and I did not want to be another man rushing at you with words." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them. A crow flew over from somewhere to somewhere else. "Robert," she said. "Yes. I told Gerald Hargrove this morning that I would not be attending the social with him." A pause. "I told him before he asked that I had a prior engagement." He felt the words land in his chest with a slow, spreading warmth. "Did you?" "I was counting on you," she said, "which is either very foolish or very wise, and I have not decided which." He took one step toward her, and she took one step toward him, and he reached out and took her cold hand in both of his. And she looked up at him with those dark eyes that had been frightened, and then measuring, and then warming by degrees across 4 months, and now looked at him with something that was clear and decided and certain. "I think it might be wise," he said. "Then take me to the social on Friday," she said. "I will take you to every social there has ever been," he said. and she laughed, and the sound of it in the cold January air was the best thing he had heard in years. He kissed her for the first time at the gate of her house on Friday night after the winter social, standing in the lamplight with the cold stars visible above the roofline and the distant sound of music still carrying from the church hall 2 streets over. It was not a rushed kiss or a careless one. He held her face in his hands and kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he has been patient about, thoroughly and with complete attention, and when he pulled back, she had her hands on the lapels of his jacket and her eyes were still closed for a second before she opened them. "Oh," she said softly, which was not a complicated word but contained considerable meaning. "Yes," he said. She laughed again, softer this time, and stood on her toes and kissed him back, brief and decided and absolutely deliberate. And then she went inside, and he stood at the gate for a full minute in the cold before he remembered where he lived and started walking. Gerald Hargrove left Caldwell in mid-February, his business concluded. He tipped his hat to Ruth in the general store before he went, and she was polite and pleasant, and Robert, who was standing at the counter buying tobacco, he did not particularly need, shook the man's hand and was civil about it, and Hargrove looked between them and nodded with the expression of a man who has reassessed a situation correctly and accepted the outcome, because he was in fact a decent enough man, just not the right one. February turned to March, and the Kansas winter began its slow, reluctant retreat. The snow melted off the prairie in patches, and the mud came up, and then the grass began to green at the edges where the south-facing slopes caught the sun, and the smell of the air changed, opening up and going soft. Robert went to the bank in Abilene in early March and came back with a specific number in his head, and sat down with a land agent named Patterson who worked out of Caldwell and dealt regularly with homestead claims along the Kansas-Indian Territory border. Patterson was a tidy, efficient man who spread maps on his desk and talked about soil quality and water rights and legal descriptions with the brisk pleasure of a man who genuinely loved his subject. He showed Robert 3 parcels in the Cherokee Strip, land that had been surveyed and was available for homestead claim under the terms being worked through with the Cherokee Nation. The strip was complicated territory, Patterson explained with some care, because the Cherokee had legitimate claim and the discussions with the federal government were ongoing. Robert knew that. He had ridden through the strip enough times to understand its history, the way the land had been promised and then renegotiated and promised again, with the casual disregard that the federal government brought to its arrangements with Indian nations. He had seen the Cherokee settlements in the strip, people who had been moved there from Georgia 50 years ago on a march that had killed thousands, and who had built something real and viable out of the land they had been given, and were now being asked to renegotiate again. He thought about that and did not feel entirely comfortable with it, and he said as much to Patterson. Patterson looked at him with mild surprise, because land agents were not accustomed to men expressing discomfort about land that was available. "The legal situation is what it is," Patterson said. "I know," Robert said. "I am going to file the claim. I just think it is worth knowing clearly what you are filing on and where it comes from." He filed the claim on a 160-acre parcel along a creek called Willow Branch, southwest of the line. The land was good. He had ridden over it twice, and the soil turned dark and deep when you pushed a stick into it, and the creek ran clear, and the grass was tall, and the cottonwoods along the water were old enough to tell you the water was reliable. It was not borrowed land in his heart. It was a promise he intended to make real. He told Ruth that evening, sitting at her small table with the lamp between them and the Franklin stove clicking as it heated up against the March cold. She listened to everything and then she said, "How long before you can build something on it?" "If I start in spring I can have a house up before winter," he said. "Small, a cabin first, proper later." She nodded slowly. She was turning her teacup in her hands, which was what she did when she was thinking hard. "Ruth," he said, and she looked up. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm not asking you because it is practical or because I need someone to manage a household. I am asking you because I cannot imagine building something on that land without you in it." He held her eyes. "Will you marry me?" She was very still for a moment. The stove clicked. The wind moved against the window. "Yes," she said quietly. And then she said it again more strongly, as though setting it like a post in the ground. "Yes, Robert." He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them, and she turned her hands over and held his back, and they sat like that for a while with the lamp between them and the March wind outside and something warm and complete sitting in the room with them that had been building for 5 months and had finally, definitively, arrived. They were married in April of 1879 in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, Reverend Cleary officiating, Mrs. Briggs in the front pew with a handkerchief pressed to her eye, Hector Diaz and his wife Carmen seated beside Ben Lassiter, who had ridden in from a job east of Wichita specifically for the occasion, and spent the whole ceremony with the expression of a man who had predicted something correctly and was allowing himself quiet satisfaction about it. Ruth wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she bought at the general store, a soft green wool that made her dark eyes deeper, and she carried a small bunch of early prairie wildflowers that Robert had gotten up before dawn to go out to the edge of town and find. He stood up at the altar in his best shirt with his hat in his hands and watched her walk down the aisle toward him, and felt something that was past ordinary happiness, something solemn and enormous and good. They said their vows with the clarity of two people who had thought carefully about every word. When Reverend Cleary said, "You may kiss your bride," Robert kissed Ruth with one hand gentle on her face, and she rose up toward him and grabbed the front of his jacket the way she had at the gate in January, as though she was holding on to something she intended to keep. The town of Caldwell, or that portion of it that had come to know Ruth Finley and Robert Kendrick across the winter, celebrated them with a supper at Mrs. Prentice's eating house that went until late in the evening with considerable conversation, and Mrs. Prentice's exceptional pie and Ben Lassiter, making a toast that began with a remark about a man who spent 4 months trying to convince himself he was not thinking about a woman, and concluded with something genuinely moving that caused Mrs. Briggs to use the handkerchief again. They spent the night at the hotel in Caldwell because there was nowhere else to spend it, and in the morning they loaded the wagon that Robert had bought from a farmer north of town, everything Ruth owned and everything Robert owned, which between them was not a great deal but was more than either of them had started with, and they drove south and west toward the Cherokee Strip and the land along Willow Branch Creek. The drive took 3 days. They camped the first 2 nights on the open prairie under a sky full of stars that was so enormous Ruth lay on her back in her blankets and stared up at it in silence for a long time. "What are you thinking?" Robert asked. "I am thinking that I am very far from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania," she said. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" She reached over in the dark and found his hand. "The best thing," she said. On the 3rd afternoon they came up over a low rise and the land along Willow Branch opened out below them, the cottonwoods making a line of new green along the water, the grass tall and still with that early spring growth, the creek catching the afternoon light. It was plain land and beautiful in its plainness, the kind of beauty that does not announce itself but accumulates the more you look at it. Ruth stood up in the wagon seat and looked, and Robert watched her look. "It is real," she said. "It is real," he said. They built the cabin through the spring and into early summer, Robert doing the heavy work, Ruth working alongside him with a competency at physical labor that surprised him, until he remembered that she had grown up helping run a boarding house and managing a classroom of 30 children, and that both of those things required a considerable amount of practical ability. Ben Lassiter came out for 2 weeks in May and helped with the roof and the walls, and Hector Diaz sent a wagon load of supplies with a note that said simply, "Good luck and good soil," from the Diaz family. The cabin, when it was done, was small and solid and fitted to the land. 2 rooms, with a covered porch on the south side that caught the afternoon light, and a kitchen garden Ruth put in along the east wall, orderly rows of vegetables already beginning to push up through the turned soil. Robert built her bookshelves again, proper ones this time, from good timber, and she arranged her books on them and put the braided rug on the floor and hung the curtains she had brought from Caldwell. Standing in the doorway of the finished cabin on a June evening with the light going orange across the prairie, Robert felt something settle in him, some long restless thing that had been looking for a place to be still, and he stood quiet and let it settle. Ruth came and stood beside him, her shoulder against his arm, and they looked at the land together. "We have a lot of work ahead," she said. "We do," he said. "I am not afraid of work," she said. "I know it," he said, and put his arm around her and pulled her close. The first summer on Willow Branch was hard in the way that homestead work is always hard, the kind of hard that is also deeply satisfying because you can see what your work makes, and it is real and solid and yours. Robert broke ground for the first fields, oats and a kitchen garden expanded from Ruth's original planting. He built a proper barn before the summer was out, because the livestock they had acquired, 2 cows, 4 hogs, and the 30 chickens Ruth had insisted on, needed shelter, and he intended to add horses in the fall. Ruth managed the house and the garden and kept the books for the farm, and twice a week rode into the nearest small settlement, a cluster of buildings around a general store called Crossing, 8 miles south, to pick up supplies and post and whatever news came through. At Crossing she also, within about 6 weeks of their arrival, started teaching. It was informal at first, the children of 3 nearby farming families coming to the cabin on Tuesday and Thursday mornings for lessons, Ruth teaching on the porch in good weather and inside when it rained. By fall there were 7 children, and by the following spring there were 12, and the community around Crossing had begun to talk seriously about a proper school building. Robert watched her teach one Thursday morning in August, standing at the edge of the porch with his hat in his hands after coming in from the south field. She was working fractions with the older children, drawing on a slate, patient and precise and quick to shift approach when she saw understanding failing, and the children watched her the way people watch someone who is genuinely good at something, with a kind of attention that is itself a form of admiration. He thought about the night he had first seen her, shaking in the lamplight outside the Silver Spur, the carpetbag at her feet and the fear behind her eyes and the voice steadier than her hands. He thought about what she had become in a year, or that she had been all along, and was now in a place where it could be fully expressed. He loved her so thoroughly, and with so little reservation that sometimes it felt like a physical weight, something he carried in his chest that was heavy in the best possible way. In the fall of 1879, Ruth told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning in October, which was exactly 1 year after he had offered her his coat, a fact that struck him only later and made him shake his head slowly at the quiet accuracy of life's timing. She said it simply, across the breakfast table watching his face. He stood up from his chair and went around the table and knelt down beside hers and took her hand and pressed it to his face, and she put her other hand on his hair, and they stayed like that for a moment without speaking. "You are happy," she said. "I am completely undone," he said, which was honest. She laughed. "That will do," she said. The baby was born in June of 1880, a boy, delivered by the capable and no-nonsense wife of one of the neighboring farmers, a Swedish woman named Britta Halvorsen, who had delivered 14 babies before this one, and managed the whole business with the calm efficiency of someone doing something well understood and important. Robert paced the porch for 6 hours straight, and Britta came out twice to look at him with the tolerant exasperation of someone observing expected and predictable behavior. The baby was healthy and demanding, and had Robert's coloring and Ruth's mouth, and the particular alert quality of a person who had come into the world ready to find it interesting. They named him Thomas Kendrick, a solid name for a solid person. Robert held Thomas for the first time sitting at the edge of the bed, where Ruth lay exhausted and beautiful, and watched Robert's face the way she always watched his face when she wanted to understand what was happening inside him. He held the baby carefully, his big hands very gentle, and looked down at this small, breathing person who had his wife's mouth and his own coloring and was utterly, completely real. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. "We have been waiting for you." Thomas regarded him with the unfocused gravity of a newborn and made a small sound that could have meant anything. Ruth reached over and put her hand on Robert's arm, and he looked up at her. And the look between them was the kind that does not require words because everything that needs saying is already known. The following years built themselves out on the land along Willow Branch, with the steady accumulation of good work and good seasons, and the particular richness of a life being made by two people who have chosen each other fully and continued choosing each other through ordinary days and difficult ones alike. The farm grew. Robert added 40 acres in the fall of 1880 and another 40 in the spring of 1882, building the fields and the fencing systematically, crop by crop, season by season. He added horses, 4 good-working animals and then 2 more. He built a proper granary and expanded the barn and dug a proper root cellar with the help of a neighboring farmer named Oscar Halvorson, Britta's husband, a large, quiet Swede who worked with the same methodical thoroughness as his wife and had become, through the particular intimacy of neighboring on the frontier, one of Robert's closest friends. Ruth built the school. She had campaigned through 1880 and 1881, writing letters to the county seat, attending every meeting of the nascent community organization at Crossing, making her case with the steady, evidence-based logic she brought to everything. And in the spring of 1882, a proper one-room schoolhouse went up on the south edge of Crossing, paid for in part by the county and in part by the families who used it. Ruth was its teacher, a position she held with the same combination of precision and warmth that had made her good at it in Caldwell, and she rode the 8 miles each way on the days she taught, or in bad weather stayed in a small room in the home of the storekeeper's family in Crossing. Thomas, who was 2 and then 3 and then 4, spent teaching days with Robert, who discovered that farming with a small boy as an attendant was an exercise in narration, Thomas requiring a description and explanation of everything Robert did and why. Robert found that he did not mind this. He was a patient man, and Thomas was genuinely curious, which Robert considered the most important quality a person could have. And the hours they spent together in the fields and the barn were some of the best hours of his life. Ruth brought Thomas to school on some days as he got older and sat him in the back with books while she taught. And Thomas, who had grown up listening to his mother explain fractions and grammar and the history of the United States to other children, was reading by the time he was 5 in a way that made Ruth openly delighted and Robert quietly proud. In the spring of 1883, Ruth told him she was pregnant again. This time she told him in the kitchen after supper, while Thomas was asleep, and Robert was at the table mending a piece of harness. She came and sat across from him and said it plainly, and he set down the harness and reached across the table for her hand with the same certainty he always reached for her, the certainty of a man who has learned exactly where the most important thing in his life is and goes to it directly. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said, "and very pleased." "Both are reasonable," he said. The second baby was a girl, born in November of 1883 on an afternoon when the first snow of the season was coming down outside, and Robert had a fire in the stove so hot the windows were steaming. Britta Halvorson presided again with her usual efficient authority, and this time Robert stayed inside in the kitchen rather than on the porch because the cold was too sharp, and he drank enough coffee to keep a small town awake, and carved a piece of wood into no particular shape out of something to do with his hands. The girl was small and fierce and wailed with considerable authority from her first moment, and Thomas, who had been allowed in after the main events were concluded, looked at her with the solemn assessment of a 3-year-old confronting something unexpected and important, and then said, "She is very loud." "She is going to keep it that way," Ruth said from the bed, looking at her daughter with an expression of complete love and mild amusement. They named her Eleanor Jane Kendrick, after Ruth's mother. Eleanor turned out to be exactly what Thomas had observed on first meeting: loud, direct, and absolutely convinced of her own importance, which Ruth said with some amusement was a quality she intended to encourage in a girl. The years on Willow Branch were not without difficulty. There was a drought summer in 1882 that took most of the oat crop and made the kitchen garden a struggle, and required Robert to draw on the savings more deeply than he liked. There was a sickness in the winter of 1884 that laid Ruth low for nearly 3 weeks, a lung illness that had Robert frightened in a way he had not been frightened since his father died, sitting beside her bed at night with his hand on hers and the lamp burning, and the sound of her difficult breathing the only sound in the house. She recovered fully but slowly, and for 2 weeks after she was well enough to sit up, Robert could not look at her without feeling a retroactive cold terror that he kept off his face but could not entirely keep out of his eyes. She saw it. She always saw what was in his eyes. "I am not going anywhere," she said one evening when she caught him looking at her that way. "I know," he said. "You are still frightened," she said. "A little," he admitted. She reached across and took his hand. "I am here," she said. "I am completely and entirely here." "I know it," he said, and held her hand and looked at her until the cold thing in his chest settled. There was also, in the summer of 1885, a dispute with a rancher named Curtis Vane, who had large holdings to the west, and had developed a habit of running his cattle through the Willow Branch Creek bottom in a way that damaged the fencing and fouled the water. Robert dealt with this first by speaking directly to Vane, and then, when Vane proved uninterested in direct speech, by demonstrating in a series of practical and stubborn ways that the fencing was going to be maintained, and the water rights were going to be respected regardless of Vane's preferences. He also wrote a very careful letter to the county land office documenting the situation, which Ruth helped him draft, applying her teacher's precision to the legal language until it was exact and clear and unanswerable. The dispute was resolved in Robert's favor through the county, and Vane moved his cattle elsewhere, and Robert fixed the fencing and never let it go unattended after that. Ruth followed the dispute with full attention, and on the night the county letter came back confirming the resolution, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, which was not something either of them did often, and raised hers with a small, satisfied smile that Robert thought was one of the best things he had ever seen on a human face. "To the county land office," she said. "To an excellent letter," he said. "We write very well together," she said. "We do most things well together," he said, and meant it in every possible dimension. "Yes," she agreed and drank her whiskey. In the summer of 1886, Caldwell felt far away and long ago, a place that existed in the specific quality of Robert's memory as both very clear and very small, the kind of memory that has the sharp edges of something important. He thought sometimes about the night he had ridden in cold and tired and had not planned to stop, had planned to ride straight through. He thought about what straight through would have meant. He could not hold the thought for long. It was too close to a version of his life that contained no Ruth, no Thomas, no Eleanor, no Willow Branch, no bookshelves or kitchen garden or braided rug or any of it, and that version was not something he could look at directly without a cold wind going through him. He thought instead about the coat. He still had the coat. Ruth had given it back to him the previous winter, the canvas duster, considerably more worn than it had been in 1878, 1 button replaced and a patch on the right elbow, but still sound. He had tried to give it back to her, and she had said no. "It is yours, it was always yours, I was just borrowing it." He wore it on cold mornings in the fields, and it was the most comfortable thing he owned. On an evening in October of 1886, the exact 8-year anniversary of the night in Caldwell, Robert was sitting on the south porch with Thomas, who was now 6 and deeply interested in the stars. And they were looking at the October sky, and Robert was explaining the constellations the way his own father had explained them to him, pointing and naming. Orion just coming up over the eastern horizon, Cassiopeia high and clear in the north. Ruth came out with a lamp and set it on the porch rail and settled into the chair beside Robert and looked up with them. "There is Orion," Thomas said, pointing with the authority of recent knowledge. "There he is," Ruth agreed. "Papa says he is a hunter," Thomas said. "I am going to be a farmer." "A farmer is a good thing to be," Ruth said. "Papa is a farmer," Thomas said with the simple, settled satisfaction of a small boy for whom this fact was the foundation of all other facts. Robert reached over and found Ruth's hand in the lamplight, and she took it without looking at him, both of them looking up at the stars while Thomas narrated his understanding of the sky. He thought about October of 1878, the lamplight outside the silver spur, her teeth chattering, the coat in his hands. "What are you thinking?" she said quietly, under Thomas's star commentary. "About the coat," he said. She squeezed his hand. She knew exactly what he meant without any further explanation, which was one of the many things about being with the right person that still struck him with quiet astonishment, that so many things could be communicated without words because the shared history between them was the longest and most complete sentence either of them had ever written. "I was terrified of you," she said, just as quietly. "That night, I know," he said. "And then I was not," she said. "I know that too," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked up at the stars with Thomas still pointing and naming. And the lamp made its warm circle on the porch, and the October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the prairie was dark and enormous, and theirs in the way that land becomes yours not through legal description alone, but through every seed you plant in it, and every season you watch it through, and every night you fall asleep to the sound of it. Eleanor made her appearance on the porch in her nightgown, having escaped the bed she had been put to twice already, and climbed into Ruth's lap with the absolute confidence of a 2-year-old who knew her exact position in the world. Ruth wrapped her arms around her daughter without interrupting her quiet conversation with the stars, and Robert watched them both, his daughter's dark curls against his wife's shoulder, Thomas still narrating the sky, and felt the weight in his chest that was love, the good heavy kind, the kind that is not going anywhere. The spring of 1887 brought a third child, a boy they named James, who arrived in March with considerably less drama than either of his siblings, as though he had decided to enter the world efficiently and get on with things. He had Ruth's eyes and something in the set of his face that was already, even at birth, suggesting a seriousness of purpose. Thomas was, at 6, deeply interested in the baby in the way of an older sibling who is simultaneously fascinated and occasionally resentful. Eleanor, who was 3, was mainly interested in pointing out all the ways in which James did not yet do anything useful. "He cannot walk," she said. "You could not walk either," Ruth said. "I can walk now," Eleanor said, as though this resolved the argument. "He will manage," Robert said. James did manage. He was, as it turned out, a good-natured baby and then a good-natured child, steady and unflappable in a way that seemed to arrive fully formed, and he toddled after his father around the farm with the same faithful attendance that Thomas had once maintained, while Thomas was now old enough to be actually useful in the fields and took this responsibility with an almost comic seriousness. The farm by 1888 was producing well. 200 acres under cultivation, a full working barn, a smokehouse, the kitchen garden Ruth kept with the same precision she applied to her classroom. The chickens multiplied from the original 30 to a flock that kept the family in eggs and provided a small income besides. Robert had expanded the cabin twice, adding rooms as the family required them, and the original 2-room structure had become a proper 4-room house with a good kitchen and 2 sleeping rooms, and a sitting room where the bookshelves stood, and the braided rug lay on the floor, and the Franklin stove, replaced now with a proper iron cookstove in the kitchen, had given way to a fireplace that Robert had built himself with stone from the creek. Ruth still taught at the school in Crossing, though her days there had reduced as the children grew and required more of her at home. She had trained a young woman named Alice Garrett, newly arrived from Missouri and wanting teaching work, to take over 2 of the weekly sessions, and Ruth supervised and supported Alice with the same invested interest she brought to her students, because she believed that teaching people to teach was the most efficient multiplication of good she could imagine. On a warm evening in September of 1888, Robert came in from the south field with his hat pushed back, and his face browned from the summer, and found Ruth at the kitchen table with the farm ledger open, and her face wearing the particular expression of pleasant concentration she had when the numbers were going right. "Good harvest," she said without looking up. "Excellent," he said. He poured water from the pitcher on the counter and drank it. "Better than last year." "Significantly better," she said. "If we set aside what we usually set aside and pay down the equipment note, we still have a surplus." He sat down across from her. "What would you do with a surplus?" She looked up. In the evening light she was 34 years old and the finest thing he had ever seen, not in the way of a woman preserved from time, but in the way of a woman who had lived fully, and had all of it in her face in a way that was more interesting than any smooth, unlined version would ever have been. "There is a proper library being established in the county seat," she said. "They are asking for contributions of books and funds." A pause. "Also, Thomas is going to need more schooling than I can give him in another year or 2. There is an academy in Wichita." "He is 8 years old," Robert said. "I am thinking ahead," she said. "You are always thinking ahead," he said, not as a criticism. "Someone has to," she said, with the small smile that meant she was enjoying this conversation. "What else?" he said. She closed the ledger and folded her hands on top of it. "I would like to build a proper front porch," she said. "The south porch is fine, but it is narrow. I want a wide porch on the east side where the morning light comes in and we can sit with coffee and see the whole field." "That is a fine use of a surplus," he said. "I think so too," she said. He built the porch that fall, working on it in the evenings after the field work was done, and it was finished before the cold set in. A wide, deep porch on the east side of the house with 2 good chairs, and a railing Robert made smooth enough that you could run your hand along it without catching splinters. On the first morning it was finished, Ruth came out with 2 cups of coffee before dawn, and they sat in the dark and watched the sun come up over the flat eastern horizon in a slow, enormous sweep of orange and pink that turned the whole prairie gold for about 20 minutes. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. 10 years. He counted it forward from October of 1878. The woman shaking outside the silver spur to this woman here, beside him on this porch on this land that they had made into a life together. He could not have told you, on that cold October night in Caldwell, that he was holding his coat out to his future, to the person who was going to be the organizing principle of everything he became. He had been tired and it was cold, and she was shivering and he had a coat, and it was the right thing to do. He thought it was possible that all the most important things began that simply. He said as much to Ruth, watching the last of the sunrise fade from extraordinary to merely beautiful. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I think you are right. I think large lives start from very small gestures." A pause. "I think I knew something when you put that coat on me." "I did not know what it was yet, but I knew something." "What did you think you knew?" he asked. "I thought this is a man who sees a person," she said. "Not a problem or an inconvenience or an opportunity. A person." She looked at him. "That is rarer than it should be." "I saw you very clearly," he said. "I know you did," she said. "I have always known it." They sat with their coffee in the morning light, and the farm stretched out before them. The fields and the barn and the garden and the cottonwoods along the creek and the wide flat sky above it all. And in the house behind them Thomas was probably already awake and reading, and Alina would still be burrowed in her bed refusing the morning for another half hour at least, and James would be somewhere in between. That dependable middle state of the youngest child, who has learned to navigate between the certainties of his siblings. Thomas came out to find them, as he often did, barefoot and still in his nightclothes with a book under his arm, and climbed onto the porch and settled on the railing with the easy confidence of a boy who had grown up on this particular porch, even if it was newly built. He opened his book and began reading in the morning light, and after a moment looked up and said, "What are you looking at?" "Everything," Robert said. Thomas looked out at the farm with the considering expression of someone taking a question seriously. "It is good everything," he said, and went back to his book. Ruth met Robert's eyes, and in the look between them was 10 years of mornings, the ones in the drafty little house in Caldwell, and the ones in the cabin, and the ones in the growing house on Willow Branch, all of them leading to this particular morning, this particular porch, this particular boy reading on the railing. And in a few minutes Alina would come out with her hair not yet brushed and her opinions already fully formed, and James would follow with his steady, unassuming presence, and the day would begin. Ruth leaned her shoulder against Robert's and looked at their land in the morning light, and felt the particular quality of happiness that is not an event but a condition, not something that happens to you, but something you have built deliberately out of small, consistent things across 10 years of days. She had come to the West frightened and deceived and cold, standing outside a saloon in a windstorm with $11.30 and a broken carpetbag, and this man had offered her his coat. She had understood in the moment she took it that she was accepting more than warmth. She had not known exactly what she was accepting. She knew now. She knew it in the children on the porch, and the books on the shelves, and the garden along the east wall, and the 40 acres of good soil turning toward another spring, and the 10 years of evenings at the kitchen table, and the conversations and the silences and the 1,000 ordinary gestures of a shared life, the cup of coffee that appeared without asking, the hand found in the dark, the look across a room that said everything. She had never let him walk away. She had understood, standing in that lamplight in October of 1878, that this was a man worth holding on to. She had been right. She was almost always right about the things that mattered, which she never said out loud but which Robert freely acknowledged, and he said it again now, this morning on the east porch, looking at her, looking at the field. "You were right," he said, which was not connected to anything they had said in the last few minutes but which she understood immediately, because that was also one of the things about 10 years and the right person. "About," she said. "Everything," he said. She smiled. It was the smile that had been building since the second week of their acquaintance, the one that started small and went all the way up to her eyes, and had not lost a single degree of its warmth across all the years and all the mornings. "Yes," she said, with the easy confidence of a woman who has earned the right to agree. He reached over and took her hand, and she took his back, and the morning light moved across the fields, and the cottonwoods turned gold along the creek, and somewhere in the house Alina had finally, volubly, met the day, and James's steady voice could be heard explaining something to her in patient, reasonable tones that she was almost certainly ignoring. Thomas turned a page. Robert and Ruth sat on their porch on their land in the October light, which was the same angle and quality of light that had been falling over Caldwell, Kansas, the night everything began, and they held hands and looked at their life, which was large and solid and real and built from the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world. A coat offered, a hand extended. A woman who had nowhere to stand, and a man who had been about to ride straight through, and the 30 seconds in which everything had balanced on the edge of nothing before it became everything. They had built a farm from it, and a school, and a family, and a life that was so completely itself that neither of them could imagine anymore the separate lives they had been living before October of 1878, though they both remembered clearly enough to be grateful. The farm would pass to Thomas someday, who already walked the field rows with the concentrated attention of a boy who understood what he was inheriting. Alina would go wherever her convictions took her, which Ruth suspected was somewhere loud and important and very much on her own terms. James would do something careful and good and real. That much was written in him already. And Robert Kendrick and Ruth Finley Kendrick would grow old on Willow Branch, adding years to the life the way they had added rooms to the house, one necessary thing at a time, until the whole structure was so solid, and so theirs that the prairie itself seemed to lean toward it slightly, the way things lean toward warmth. It had started with a coat in the wind. It had ended, or rather it had not ended at all. It had simply continued, the way good things continue, not with a conclusion but with a deepening, the way a creek deepens as it goes, cutting its channel into good soil, running clear and cold and reliable year after year, carrying everything that matters forward into whatever comes next. Robert looked at his wife in the morning light and thought, as he thought every day, that he was the luckiest man on the Kansas plain and possibly anywhere else, and that the best decision he had ever made was stopping Copper at the hitching post of the Silver Spur Saloon in Caldwell on a cold October night, and walking toward a woman who was shaking in the wind. He had offered her a coat. She had never let him walk away. He would thank her every day for the rest of his life for that, and she would tell him he was being sentimental, and he would say yes and mean it as a compliment, and she would smile and hold his hand, and the morning would come again over the fields of Willow Branch, and the cottonwoods would keep their faithful line along the water, and the life they had chosen would continue to be the realest thing either of them had ever known.